Hi, this is Sanjay Bhatia, and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. And today we have with us once again Rob Hirschfeld from RackN. Microsoft or GitHub, they announced that they're acquiring NPM,
right,
which is the company behind NPM. If you look at NPM, it's they have been going through some tough time when it comes to monetizing open source. So this is not a new story when it comes to open source. But we're also looking at this whole COVID-19. Which is creating an entirely different kind of crisis where, a company, as we had a discussion earlier, that a lot of companies are going through, this rethinking process. There will be layoffs.
Yeah.
So now there are two ways to look at it. Either, since open source is all maintained by community members, it may not have any impact whether you are hired by a company or not. But at the same time, a lot of companies actually sponsor these projects. And if those companies are struggling with monetization, those projects will get kind of affected. So can you just share in general, what do you think about the impact on open source?
And this is a question I'd love to get broad community input on, because there's a lot of opinions about open source. So I'm not entirely right. We spent a lot of time in 2019 tearing our hair out wondering about open source license models and sustainability and things like that. One thing I do know is that a lot of open source projects are maintained by companies that that aren't their core profit items. And so when you look at a retraction or a recession where companies are looking for places to cut costs, one of the places that they're going to look to first are places where they don't have a profit motive. There's no revenue from those capabilities. So the idea that big companies are maintaining open source projects for the community good is going to get tested as companies look for places where they can conserve revenue. And I think that's a really critical thing. And the same is going to be true with open source startups that are hoping to monetize support or consulting, but have no real gate across the front of their infrastructure. And so companies might decide they can use the open source project and not pay the sustaining engineers that are working in that project. These are really serious concerns about the whole open source model, which relies on goodwill and free money.
There are two ways to do open source. One is you maintain the code yourself as a company funded project, or you put that code in a neutral foundation where a lot of companies are sharing their resources, so the sustainability is a bit it has longer mortality. What do you think from that perspective? Should companies move their code base to neutral foundations, or even actually neutral foundations also rely on sponsorship from the same companies? So if those companies run dry, the foundations will run dry too.
Single company open source is, which some people would say isn't open source at all. But that seems to be a more workable model. I mean, you talked about NPM. I would look at Rancher, which just announced a major round of funding, $40 million. And HashiCorp did a huge round, $157 million on a multi-billion-dollar valuation. And those are single, Rancher, while it's part of Kubernetes, also has a lot of components that they maintain themselves as single vendor open source. And so, these are places where those are really commercial models. Those companies control their source code. There is a gate. There is a reason why people want to monetize and hire the companies to get access to the code. And that model seems to be working. I really wonder if COVID-19 had really hit, a month ago, if we would have seen those funding rounds announced and closed, because it's the expectation is that a downturn like this pulls back a whole bunch of term sheets and actions and things like that. I've seen some Twitter threads about exactly that. And you might say, wow, who cares about the venture market? Who cares about these fundings? But that is how these projects are built. They're funded by investors for the most part until they reach some type of mainstream capability.
So you think that the company-backed open source projects are more sustainable than the foundation owned?
I think that the company-backed open source ones have clear commercial models and sustaining models. And so that when you want to pay money to sustain the project that you want, yes, I do think that those are more sustaining models. I mean, if you look at what even in Kubernetes, which is a foundation maintained open source project, Red Hat has a variant of it called OpenShift that is, Kubernetes, but not Kubernetes. You don't get Kubernetes from Red Hat, you get OpenShift. And the same thing is true for Google with what they're doing in Anthos for VMware and their big announcements around vSphere and Pacific and Tanzu. Those are vendor products. And so those are being maintained and supported because of the vendors. How that flows back into a straight out Kubernetes product isn't clear. And then the whole ecosystem around Kubernetes with all the sub projects, where there are some startups that are trying to sustain those. It's not clear yet that those are real models that they can work with. And I could give examples from OpenStack too if you want. SwiftStack just got purchased. Which was basically the primary company maintaining Swift out of OpenStack. These single vendor open source seems to be a sustainable model. Although I know there's a lot of people in the open source communities who don't feel like that's actually open source.
The definition of open source may vary depending on how you look at it. As long as there is source code available on GitLab or GitHub that I can play with, as long as you are not throwing the code at the end of the when you release it out. It's open source, so people may have political motive.
The Red Monk team, Stephen O'Grady on that has been pretty clear that's source available licensing. From that perspective, if there's no community maintaining it, and that's the challenge, right? When there's a certain degree of free money and everybody's confident in profits and it's clear where you're going to make money around the source code, then I can see open source, community developed open source being really attractive. And I would love to have a debate about this, right? You and I are discussing it, and it's not clear what the right answers are. It's an evolving thing, and people are going to have to shift. And I would love for people to show examples of saying, no, this is a project that is maintained in the community by a group of vendors that's proven recession proof. Because the last 10 years we haven't had to worry about it. NPM's a great example of that. They went to Microsoft. Microsoft has a huge reason through Git to make sure that it's sustained because it's a central component in a lot of Git repositories, and it's it's basically a library that puts them more in the middle of things, which is what they're trying to do. We'll see what happens with other open source projects.
One more thing that I'm kind of curious about is that when you're talking about the vendor-backed projects, there is a very clear-cut commercial business model behind those projects where they're adding a lot of features or value on top of that, versus when you're talking about a project maintained by a specific foundation where there's an even playing field. Sometimes big companies, they do put their project there because they but if the vendors don't see that they can really monetize from that project, they will not be putting money into it because that money just going. Actually, that's more or less like kind of, I would not use the word charity, but it's kind of putting towards the common good. That hey, let's maintain the project. But if you're not monetizing from the project, especially when things like COVID is happening, then that also becomes a big challenge for those companies to continue to fund a foundation.
I feel like that has been happening to some Apache projects, and that's been one of the challenges with Apache projects is that they don't allow you to market the project once it's in Apache as the brand, and so it does make it hard, especially for the Apache projects that are very single vendor maintained projects. Then they sort of lose a lot of the benefits they would have from a commercial stream around those projects. And so I think that does become a real challenge. And so I think those are big deals for us to think about for how these projects are sustained. And you made a comment about foundations being sort of this, very even playing field. And I see comments, where people say, hey, wait, it's not. This is a pay to play. You buy seats on boards in these foundations. And so big companies do get to buy influence. My hope had always been that would be the users buying the seats and making sure things work. And I see that happening to an extent. Cloud Foundry, I think, did a really good job of trying to make sure that the board seats were held by users, not vendors. But there is a pay to play component even in how this is going. And once again, the Linux Foundation brings in a lot of profit and a lot of people do pay in the Linux Foundation. They do a lot of good work. However, it's a question on how you're going to support all these pieces in a downturn, right? What's the real value for being, supporting these shared code foundations?
Yeah, since you mentioned the Linux Foundation, I was going to mention them that they have done a good job by kind of separation of power. Yes, you can buy a seat, but it has virtually no impact on the actual code development because that is still
they do separate. Yeah, the technical committees are separate from the boards and the steering commissions and things like that. They do, and I think that it's a real thing. And big companies have more people to sit on committees and sort of steer things around. That's a whole nother discussion about how these open source committees deliver and what it really looks like to get code into market. Open source in my mind has been code first. Prove it and deliver it. And sometimes we find these committee. We have a bit of committee design going on in that. Committee design is not bad. It's just slower, and it doesn't. And it can be very influenced by the people who are on that committee.
The funny thing is when you look at open source, a lot of people think this more or less like democracy, but that is not the case. If it's no offense to any big company, if you look at Red Hat or Google or Microsoft, if the community is as large as 100 developers, if 70 developers come from your company, that is, that product will lean towards whether you look at system D versus its system depends on what you're looking at. So you can actually buy influence. I would not use. I don't think the buy is the right term, but these are not democratic projects. A company with a lot of resources may unintentionally deploy so many resources to a project that the project will have like 90% developer base is kind of aligned towards that company. So the every line of code that is going into the project is kind of aligning with the business goals of the company. So
it's a really good point. And we saw buying influence a lot in the OpenStack.
I would not
projects.
say buying influence. No, I don't want to use the buying because it might look derogatory.
It was you hire developers, they switch allegiances, so buying, or you bring developers into a project to influence and develop code for that project. But I think that confuses the idea of paddling the boat versus steering the boat. And so if you just show up with more paddlers on a boat that's not well steered, it just goes in circles, right? Because and I see this in open source projects all the time. It's like, we're going to put 50 developers on this project. And you're like, all right, the architectures, which is really a couple of people figuring out the right architecture, isn't settled enough. You dump a whole bunch of people into a project before the architecture is settled, or a whole bunch of users into a project before it's settled. You actually have a really, really, really fragile system. In some ways, this is why Kubernetes to me was able to eclipse Docker Swarm. Docker Swarm had a clear lead. They dumped a whole bunch of users into that, created a whole bunch of inertia in what they could change in the product. And Kubernetes was moving a little bit slower. That's the funny thing about these projects. Having a big marketing push and getting a whole bunch of users and developers on a project does not create better projects until it's time for you to scale the project. I see this all the time. You can have a very small team. The Linkerd team versus the Istio team is a really good example. Linkerd had version 1. They got eclipsed by Istio for a while, and they sat down. They got version 2 much better, and they came back, and they are back in the game. Because it was a small team that understood the architecture. They'd had the ground experience of solving the problem. And that, to me, is exactly how, it's just software development. It's what learning is about. And you have to be careful in open source that you don't bypass the learning model in how the code is done. And that's something to think about for this. It's much harder to buy influence in a project than you think, because somebody can come along after the fact with a better architecture, plug in and start running really quickly. Terraform's a good example of that, for just how fast they made an impact on market. But they're going to be just as vulnerable by somebody coming along and learning the lessons that Terraform didn't learn.
Yeah, Rob, I fully agree with you. And that's what makes open source so fascinating, that, there may be, people might think that it's not democratic, but the thing is, it just solves its own problem in itself, and it's community based. So you never know who the smart person is trying to solve a problem. Despite your biggest army, they will come and, shake your whole dominance or monopoly, whatever you want to call it. But
Yep.
yeah, it's fascinating. But as you said earlier, this is more or less like a topic of discussion. So I would also invite the viewers to share their thoughts and opinion, what they think about the sustainability
Tell us how
of
wrong
open
we
source.
are, please.
How wrong? Yes, exactly. It's more about how wrong. Our opinions are not proprietary, so you're more than happy to send patches.
Exactly right. Open source video discussions. Makes perfect sense. And I would add, I think the democracy for open source is actually from the users, not the creators. That's where we really enable the interesting democratic parts, the crowd parts, and the community parts. That to me is where the real power comes.
Yeah, we may agree to disagree, but that's why GNU GPL, Richard Stallman, his For Freedom is all about users and not about the creator. He wants to give users more power, what they can do with your piece of code, versus giving total control to the creators of the project. So yeah,
That's
and that is the
exactly
core
right.
values. Yeah, that's the core value of open source. He would not like me using his name with open source. He would.
I don't agree with most of what he says, but that is one
Yeah.
thing that I think is an underpinning for how open source is successful.